Pablo Ibar. He was born in Spain but moved to Florida as a young man. By age 19, he would become entangled in one of Broward County's most shocking incidents. On June 26, 1994, what happened inside Kazimir Butch Casey Socharsky's home in Miramar would be captured on video and haunt the justice system for decades. Socharsky owned Casey's Nickelodeon, a popular nightclub in Pembroke Park. That night, he was at his residence with two dancers from his club, Sharon Anderson and Willie Hodges. What they didn't know was that two masked perpetrators were about to break into the home. The incident unfolded like a nightmare. The intruders forced their way inside and took the lives of all three individuals in what investigators called execution-style offenses. What made this case unique was technology. Socharsky had a hidden security camera system that recorded the entire incident on VHS tape. The grainy footage showed two masked figures entering the home and committing the offenses. This video would become the centerpiece of evidence, but it would also create decades of legal battles. Pablo Ibar and Seth Panover were arrested and charged with the triple offense. Prosecutors claimed Ibar was one of the masked perpetrators in the video. The case relied heavily on the security footage, witness testimony, and later, DNA evidence. In 2000, Ibar was found guilty and sentenced to death. He spent 16 years in a capital punishment facility, but Ibar's case was far from over. Appeals courts found significant problems with his original defense. His attorney had failed to properly investigate the case and present crucial evidence. In 2016, the Florida Supreme Court overturned his conviction and granted him a new trial. Ibar was moved from the capital punishment facility to a regular correctional facility. The retrial began in 2018. This time, prosecutors used advanced DNA analysis technology called True Allele to examine mixed DNA samples from the incident scene. The new evidence seemed to link Ibar to the scene. On January 19, 2019, after 22 hours of deliberation over 4 days, the jury again found Pablo Ibar guilty of the three offenses. However, the penalty phase brought a different outcome. Instead of death, the jury recommended life in a correctional facility without parole. Ibar, now 46 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars rather than face the death penalty. The Casey's Nickelodeon incident remains one of Florida's most debated cases. The grainy security footage, the advanced DNA technology, and the decades-long legal battle made it a landmark case in forensic science and criminal justice. Tiffany Cole. She was born on December 3, 1981, and by age 23, she would become one of Florida's most notorious offenders. Cole grew up knowing the Summer family from South Carolina. When Carol and Reggie Summer, both 61 years old, moved to Jacksonville, Florida in March 2005, they maintained contact with Cole. The Summers even sold Cole a car with monthly payment arrangements, trusting someone they considered family. But Cole had different plans. On July 8, 2005, Cole arrived at the Summer residence in Englewood with 3 accomplices: her boyfriend Michael James Jackson, Alan Wade, and Bruce Nixon. What started as a visit quickly turned into a nightmare. The group forced their way into the home and took the elderly couple against their will. The Summers were bound with duct tape and forced into the trunk of their own car. Before leaving, the perpetrators forced Carol and Reggie to provide their ATM card information. The group drove the terrified couple across state lines to Georgia. What happened next shocked investigators. Carol and Reggie Summer were buried alive in a shallow grave while still breathing. The offenders then returned to Florida and began using the couple's ATM cards to withdraw money, showing no remorse for what they had done. The incident unraveled when suspicious ATM activity caught the attention of law enforcement. Security cameras captured images of the perpetrators using the Summers' cards. Cole and her accomplices were arrested within days. During questioning, one of the co-defendants led police to the burial site in Georgia, where the bodies were recovered. Cole's trial began in 2007. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold calculation and greed. The evidence was overwhelming. ATM footage, witness testimony, and physical evidence all pointed to Cole's involvement. Despite her defense team's efforts, the jury found Cole guilty of first-degree offense and kidnapping. On March 6, 2008, she was sentenced to death. Cole's case made headlines again in 2017 when the Florida Supreme Court overturned her death sentence, ruling it was not unanimous. However, a newly composed court later reversed that decision. In August 2023, after spending nearly 2 decades in a capital punishment facility, a jury recommended life in a correctional facility without parole instead of the death penalty. Today, Tiffany Cole remains in the Florida correctional system. The woman who took the lives of 2 individuals who trusted her now faces the rest of her life behind bars, a consequence of choices that destroyed multiple families forever. Tina Brown. She was born on July 19, 1970, and by age 39 she would commit one of Florida's most brutal offenses. Brown is currently the only woman on death row in Florida, according to the state's Department of Corrections. What happened on March 24, 2010 in Ensley, Florida, would shock investigators and lead to one of the most disturbing incidents in Escambia County's recent history. 19-year-old Adriana Redon Zimmerman was attacked by 3 women who beat her with a crowbar, shocked her with a stun gun, and later set her on fire. The perpetrators were Tina Brown, her neighbor Heather Trini Lee, and her own daughter Brittany Angelique Miller. What led to such extreme violence remains difficult to understand, but the consequences were devastating. Brown was convicted of first-degree premeditated offense after she ambushed Zimmerman, attacked her repeatedly with a stun gun, gagged her, stuffed her in the trunk of a car, drove her into the woods, beat her with a crowbar, doused her with gasoline, and set her on fire. The attack was methodical and showed a level of cruelty that stunned law enforcement. Zimmerman died 16 days after the attack from severe burn injuries. For more than 2 weeks, the young woman fought for her life in the hospital before passing away from her injuries. The incident destroyed her family and left the community searching for answers about how such violence could occur. The 3 perpetrators were quickly arrested and charged with the offense of Zimmerman. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Investigators found physical evidence linking them to the incident, and witnesses came forward with testimony. Out of the trio, Brown was found guilty of first-degree premeditated offense and faced the most serious charges. On June 21, 2012, the jury found 41-year-old Tina Brown guilty of first-degree offense. The jury reportedly deliberated the case for an hour before they returned with the guilty verdict. The speed of their decision showed how clear the evidence was against Brown. A few days after Brown's conviction, on June 26, 2012, the same jury returned with their verdict on sentence, recommending death. She was originally sentenced to death in September 2012. In August 2022, Brown filed a successive motion to vacate conviction and sentences, asking the trial court to vacate her conviction and sentence of death, based on newly discovered evidence of false testimony at her trial. However, courts have consistently denied her appeals. Today, Tina Brown remains in Florida's capital punishment facility as the state's only woman sentenced to death. Her case continues to be remembered as one of the most shocking and violent incidents in recent Florida history. Rasheem Dubose was 22 years old when he committed one of Jacksonville's most shocking incidents. What happened on July 27, 2006 would not only take the life of an innocent child but also spark citywide conversations about violence and community safety. The incident began with a robbery and ended with tragedy that devastated an entire family. Dubose had been robbed by Dreshana Davis's uncle. This incident led to anger and a desire for revenge that would have devastating consequences. Dubose, along with his 2 brothers Tajwan and Terrell, decided to retaliate. Their target was the uncle, but their plan would go horribly wrong. On that deadly evening, 8-year-old Dreshana Davis was at her grandparents' home in northwest Jacksonville. She was watching The Cat in the Hat on DVD in a bedroom with her 2 younger cousins. The little girl had no idea that 3 perpetrators were about to turn her safe space into a nightmare. Rasheem Dubose and his brothers arrived at the house and opened fire. They discharged 29 rounds into the home, with prosecutors saying 22 of those shots came from Dubose's firearm. The gunfire was meant for Dreshana's uncle, but the innocent child was struck instead. As bullets rained through the walls, Dreshana was fatally wounded while trying to protect herself. The 8-year-old passed away from her injuries, wrapping herself around one of her younger cousins in her final moments. The incident shocked Jacksonville and became a rallying point for anti-violence initiatives throughout the city. The community was outraged that such a young life had been taken in such a senseless way. Law enforcement quickly identified the Dubose brothers as the perpetrators. All 3 were arrested and charged with first-degree offense. The evidence against them was overwhelming. During the trials, separate juries heard each brother's case. Tajwan and Terrell Dubose both received life sentences in a correctional facility without parole. But Rasheem, who prosecutors said fired the most shots, faced a different outcome. On December 10, 2010, he was sentenced to death for his role in Dreshana's death. Dubose spent years in Florida's capital punishment facility, but his case took a turn in 2018, following the Hearst v. Florida decision, which required unanimous jury recommendations for death sentences. His death sentence was overturned. In June 2021, at age 37, Rasheem Dubose was sentenced to life in a correctional facility without parole. Today, Rasheem Dubose remains behind bars for the rest of his life. The incident that was meant to target one person instead took the life of an innocent child and changed Jacksonville forever.
Randall Deviney was 18 years old when he took the life of a woman who had been like a grandmother to him. What happened on August 5, 2008, shocked Jacksonville when investigators discovered that the perpetrator was someone Dolores Futrell had tried to help throughout his troubled childhood. This incident would lead to one of Florida's most complex legal cases involving multiple trials and appeals. Dolores Futrell was 65 years old and lived in the West Side area of Jacksonville on Bennington Drive. She had known Deviney since he was a child and had been a positive influence in his life. Futrell was described in court documents as being like a grandmother-type figure to him during his childhood. She used to bake cookies for him, pick him up at school and give him odd jobs so he could earn money. Despite Futrell's kindness, Deviney had suffered a difficult upbringing. Deviney told two psychologists that he suffered sexual abuse at the hands of his mother and her drug-dealing boyfriend. He also said he was beaten routinely by both parents. This troubled background would eventually lead to violence. On that deadly day in August 2008, Deviney went to Futrell's home. He slit the throat of Dolores Futrell and beat her during an attempted burglary. The autopsy showed that Futrell fought for her life before her perpetrator slit her throat from ear to ear, and she bled to death. The assailant either strangled her after she'd passed or while she was still suffering from the wound. He then moved her body and staged the scene to make it appear that she had been sexually assaulted. Futrell was found deceased in her home, and DNA evidence under her fingernails pointed to Deviney as the perpetrator. Law enforcement arrested him and charged him with first-degree offense. His first trial resulted in a conviction and death sentence in 2010, but this was overturned. The conviction and death sentence were overturned after it was found that detectives had coerced a confession out of Deviney without reading him his Miranda rights. In July 2015, a Duval County jury found Randall Deviney guilty of first-degree offense in the death of his 65-year-old neighbor. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. He was sentenced to death for a second time in October 2015. However, Deviney's case continued through the courts. His second death sentence was also challenged, leading to a third trial. In December 2017, he was sentenced to death for the third time. In May 2021, the Florida Supreme Court upheld his death sentence, rejecting his appeals. Today, Randall Deviney remains in Florida's capital punishment facility. His case stands as a tragic example of how childhood trauma and violence can destroy lives, including that of someone who tried to help. Michel Tanzi was 23 years old in April 2000. He worked odd jobs around Miami and had a history of petty offenses. Nothing suggested he would become responsible for one of Florida's most shocking incidents that year. On April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta took her lunch break at the Japanese Garden on Watson Island. The 49-year-old Miami Herald employee sat in her van reading a book. She had no idea someone was watching her. Tanzi approached Acosta's van around noon. He threatened her with a razor blade and forced his way inside. Acosta tried to resist, but Tanzi overpowered her. He bound her hands and gagged her with duct tape. Then he drove her van toward the Florida Keys with Acosta trapped inside. Tanzi drove to a remote area in Monroe County. Once there, he strangled Acosta with a rope. She passed away alone, far from home. Tanzi abandoned the van and Acosta's body in the isolated location. Police found Acosta's van and body 2 days later on April 27, 2000. Investigators found Tanzi's fingerprints inside the van and on the duct tape. Security cameras from Watson Island showed Tanzi near Acosta's van that day. The evidence pointed directly to him. Officers arrested Tanzi at his Miami apartment 3 days later. He initially denied involvement but later confessed to the incident. Tanzi claimed he had been drinking and using substances. The razor blade, rope, and duct tape suggested preparation. Tanzi's trial began in 2001 in Monroe County. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree offense, carjacking, kidnapping, and armed robbery. His fingerprints, security footage, and confession left little doubt about his guilt. The jury found Tanzi guilty on all charges after 3 hours of deliberation. They recommended the death sentence unanimously. The judge sentenced Tanzi to death in 2002. Acosta's family described her as a loving mother and dedicated worker who deserved better. Tanzi spent over 20 years on death row at Florida State Prison. He appealed multiple times, but courts upheld his sentence. During his final years, Tanzi expressed remorse and wrote letters to Acosta's family asking for forgiveness.
On April 8, 2025, Tanzi received his final meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes and chocolate cake. His last words were an apology to Acosta's family. Tanzi was pronounced deceased at 6:12 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection. He was 48 years old. Janet Acosta's family witnessed the execution after 25 years of waiting for justice.
Bessman Ofkar was already in trouble with the law when he made the worst decision of his life. In May 2012, Ofkar broke into a home in Ocoee, Florida with an accomplice. The home invasion went wrong, and 3 individuals became witnesses to Okafor's offense. Alex Zaldivar, 19 years old, and 2 roommates, the Campos siblings, saw Okafor's face that night. They could identify him in court. Ofkar was arrested for the home invasion and released on bond. He wore an ankle monitor while awaiting trial. The court date was set for September 11, 2012. Zaldivar and the Campos siblings were scheduled to testify against Ofkar the next day. Ofkar knew their testimony would send him back to correctional facility. He feared prison more than anything else. On September 10, 2012, just 1 day before the trial, Ofkar made his choice. He went to Zaldivar's home in Ocoee while wearing his ankle monitor. Ofkar broke into the house where Zaldivar lived with his 2 roommates. He found all 3 individuals inside and decided to eliminate the witnesses forever. Ofkar shot Alex Zaldivar multiple times. Zaldivar passed away instantly from his wounds. Then Ofkar turned his firearm on the Campos siblings. He shot each of them once in the head, leaving them for deceased. Ofkar believed he had removed all 3 witnesses who could testify against him. The home invasion trial would have to be delayed, but Okafor's plan failed. Both Campos siblings survived their gunshot wounds to the head. They were rushed to the hospital in critical condition but miraculously lived. The siblings could still identify Ofkar as the perpetrator who shot them and caused Zaldivar's death. Okafor's attempt to silence witnesses had backfired completely. Police arrested Ofkar shortly after the shootings. The ankle monitor he wore during the incident provided evidence of his location that night. The surviving Campos siblings identified Ofkar as the offender who shot them. Physical evidence from the scene linked Ofkar to the offense. Okafor's trial began in 2015 in Orange County. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree offense for Zaldivar's death. The Campos siblings testified about the night Ofkar shot them and caused their friend's death. The jury heard how Ofkar targeted witnesses to avoid prison time. The jury found Ofkar guilty of first-degree offense. During sentencing, they recommended the death penalty by an 11-1 vote. Judge Marshall Kest sentenced Ofkar to death in November 2015. Ofkar showed barely any reaction when the judge read his sentence. Legal changes in Florida led to multiple resentencing trials for Ofkar. A 2023 trial ended in mistrial. In January 2024, another jury recommended death by a 9-3 vote. On June 24, 2024, a judge once again sentenced Ofkar to death. The courtroom proceeding took less than 5 minutes. Ofkar now sits on death row, more than a decade after he caused Alex Zaldivar's death to avoid testifying witnesses. Gary Bernard Mcray II was 24 years old when he committed one of Florida's most shocking incidents. What happened on May 23, 2004 would leave 4 people deceased and send Mcray to the Capital Punishment Facility. The incident began with paranoia, drugs, and a deadly belief that someone had betrayed him to law enforcement. Mcray believed someone at a local drug house had informed on him to police. This suspicion consumed him and led to a decision that would destroy multiple lives. On that deadly day in 2004, Mcray arrived at the drug house with revenge on his mind. What followed was a calculated attack that shocked investigators. Inside the residence were 4 individuals: John Ellis Jr., 51, Philip Parada, 53, Robin Selkirk, 45, and John Whitehead, 37. These people had no idea they were about to become targets of Mcray's rage. Without warning, Mcray opened fire. He shot and took the lives of all 4 individuals in what authorities described as execution-style offenses. The scene was devastating. 4 people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time were now deceased. Mcray fled the scene, but his freedom would not last long. Law enforcement launched an immediate investigation into the quadruple offense. Evidence quickly pointed to Mcray as the perpetrator. In November 2004, just months after the incident, Gary Mcray was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree offense. The prosecution built a strong case against him, presenting evidence that showed premeditation and cold calculation. Mcray had deliberately targeted the drug house and systematically caused the death of everyone inside. The trial revealed the extent of Mcray's actions. Prosecutors argued that his belief about being informed on was no excuse for the brutal offenses. The jury heard testimony about how Mcray had methodically taken 4 lives. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty on all counts.
During the penalty phase, the court considered whether Mcray should receive the death penalty or life in a correctional facility. The brutality of the offenses, the number of individuals affected, and the premeditated nature of the incident all weighed heavily. The court sentenced Gary Mcray to death for each of the 4 offenses. Today, Gary Mcray remains in Florida's capital punishment facility. He has spent nearly 2 decades on death row for the quadruple offense that destroyed 4 lives and multiple families. His case stands as a reminder of how paranoia and violence can lead to devastating consequences that ripple through entire communities.
William Deparvine wanted a vintage truck badly. In November 2003, he saw an advertisement in the St. Petersburg Times newspaper. Richard Van Dusen was selling his prized red 1971 Chevrolet Cheyenne pickup truck. The truck was meticulously restored and worth thousands of dollars. Deparvine contacted Van Dusen to arrange a meeting about buying the vehicle. Richard Van Dusen, 60, lived in Tierra Verde with his wife Carla Van Dusen, 58. The couple had worked hard to restore the classic pickup truck. Richard placed the advertisement hoping to find a serious buyer who would appreciate the vehicle. When Deparvine called, Richard agreed to meet him at a parking lot near St. Petersburg. On November 25, 2003, Richard and Carla drove to meet Deparvine. Richard brought the red Chevrolet Cheyenne to show the potential buyer. Carla followed behind in their other vehicle. The couple arrived at the meeting location expecting a normal truck sale. Instead, they encountered a man who had no intention of paying for anything. Deparvine approached the Van Dusens in the parking lot. He pulled out a firearm and demanded the truck keys. Richard tried to protect his wife, but Deparvine shot him multiple times. Carla screamed and tried to run, but Deparvine shot her too. Both individuals passed away from their gunshot wounds within minutes. Deparvine took the truck keys and drove away in the vintage Chevrolet Cheyenne. Police found the Van Dusens' bodies in the parking lot later that evening. The red pickup truck was missing from the scene. Investigators immediately began searching for the vintage vehicle and its thief. They processed the incident scene for evidence and interviewed witnesses who saw the truck meeting. Deparvine kept the stolen Chevrolet Cheyenne for several days after the offense. He drove it around town as if it belonged to him. But police traced the truck through its license plate and vehicle identification number. Officers spotted the vintage pickup and arrested Deparvine when he tried to flee on foot. DNA evidence linked Deparvine to the incident scene. His fingerprints were found inside both vehicles. Witnesses identified Deparvine as the man who met the Van Dusens about buying their truck. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Deparvine's trial began in 2005 in Hillsborough County. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of first-degree offense and armed robbery. The Van Dusen family testified about their loss and the pain Deparvine had caused them. The jury heard how he shot 2 innocent people for a truck. The jury found Deparvine guilty on all charges. They recommended the death sentence, though not unanimously. The judge sentenced Deparvine to death in 2006. But Deparvine's story took a bizarre turn from death row. In 2009, Deparvine filed a lawsuit claiming he owned the vintage Chevrolet Cheyenne. He sued the Van Dusen family's estate, demanding they give him the truck he took their lives for. The lawsuit outraged the community and the individuals' families. Legal changes in Florida led to new sentencing trials for Deparvine. In 2022, a new jury rejected the death penalty and sentenced him to life without parole. Deparvine remains incarcerated, still obsessed with the truck that cost 2 people their lives. Willie James Hodges was born in Alabama and became one of Florida's most dangerous offenders. By the time he reached his 40s, Hodges had left a trail of violence across state lines that would ultimately cost him his freedom and his life. What happened in December 2001 would put him on the path to the capital punishment facility, though he would never face his final sentence. Hodges was a repeat offender with a history of breaking into homes and committing violent offenses. On November 26, 2001, in Sumter County, Alabama, 66-year-old Winnie Johnson was shot and taken from life during a burglary of her home. Investigators suspected Hodges was responsible, but he had already moved on to his next target. 3 weeks later, on December 19, 2001, Hodges broke into a home in Pensacola, Florida. Inside was 58-year-old Patricia Belanger, who was preparing for a holiday trip to Idaho Falls with her family. Hodges encountered Belanger and proceeded to beat her with a claw hammer on the head and stab her once in the neck with a steak knife. The attack was brutal and immediate. Belanger passed away from her injuries. After taking Belanger's life, Hodges ransacked the house looking for valuables. He left through a window, but his timing was terrible. 2 relatives had arrived to pick up Belanger for their planned trip. When they found the front door locked but couldn't open it, they became suspicious. Stanley Clinton Taylor and Deborah Taylor, Belanger's daughter, discovered her body inside the home. the investigation moved quickly. Physical evidence at the scene pointed to Hodges as the perpetrator. On September 5, 2004, Hodges was arrested in Pensacola for 2 attempted burglaries. As a previously convicted felon, he was required to provide fingerprint and DNA samples to authorities. This evidence linked him to the Belanger offense. Hodges was charged with first-degree offense in Belanger's death. The case went to trial, and prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The jury found Willie James Hodges guilty of first-degree offense. On February 12, 2009, he was sentenced to death for the brutal offense of Patricia Belanger. Hodges spent years in Florida's capital punishment facility, but his case would take an unexpected turn. In 2017, following the Hearst v. Florida decision, his death sentence was overturned. The ruling required unanimous jury recommendations for death sentences, which Hodges had not received. He was resentenced to life in a correctional facility without parole. Willie James Hodges never faced his original death sentence. On March 26, 2024, he passed away in state prison at age 63, less than 3 years after being resentenced to life. His death ended a case that spanned more than 2 decades and affected multiple families across state lines.